Welcome to the Celestial Saga channel. Have you ever wondered why even the most powerful warriors in the galaxy are afraid of humans? It's not just about power or technology, it's about something deeper, something that makes them truly dangerous. Today we're going to tell you a story that will make you look at humanity in a completely different way. Stay tuned to find out the whole truth. Wondering why humans are considered the most terrifying Death Worlders? Oro stood before a group of elite docile warriors, the pride of Zoilea, a Category 1 Death World. His gaze swept across the room, noting the disinterested stares that suggested they'd rather be anywhere else, but stuck in his mandatory class. Sure, humans are physically strong, resilient, and incredibly adaptable. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. But this isn't just about listing their strengths. It's to show you exactly why challenging them in the upcoming joint military exercises would be a monumental mistake. So, get ready, because we're diving into what makes them such a formidable threat for the rest of the night. Oro took a deep breath, his chest swelling as he tried to project more authority to grab the attention of the tough docile crowd. He even fluffed the two golden stripes of hair running from his shoulders to his wrists, trying to appear more intimidating, but not even the slight adjustment of his glaring metal mask, covering one of his golden eyes and half his face, a feature that had always caught human attention, seemed to rattle the docile. Noticing his failure, Oro took another deep breath, trying to steady himself as he scanned the room. The docile warriors had a different build than him, muscular and tall, with fur that gleamed in varying shades of bronze, gold, and copper. Their bipedal bodies were perfectly crafted for battle, with thick tails that served as both stabilizers and weapons in combat. Each one bore bald patches, marks of past victories, and their leather and metal armor was adorned with trophies from slain beasts. These were the elite warriors of Zoilea, the fiercest fighters the planet had ever produced. Yet, as Oro looked around, he saw nothing but boredom. Corvash, the tallest of the group, a deep scar running across his face, was reclining in his chair, lazily spinning a knife between his fingers. Across from him, Zanara, with her bright copper fur and sharp yellow eyes, was tapping her claws against the table in a rhythmic, irritating pattern, clearly not paying attention. Beside her, Gorik, whose armor displayed the bones of his latest kill, was dozing off, his head nodding forward every few seconds before jerking back awake. Even Thalix, the youngest and most eager of the group, appeared distracted, staring at the ceiling as if the solution to his boredom lay hidden in the metal beams above. Virel, known for his tricky tactics in battle, was engaged in a quiet conversation with the warrior beside him, his voice low and unbothered by the ongoing class. Oro's patience was starting to wear thin. He had faced entire battalions, battled the most dangerous creatures on his homeworld, a Class 2 death world that made Zoilea seem like a vacation spot. He had clashed with some of the sharpest minds in the galaxy, but nothing had tested his nerves as much as this room full of indifferent warriors. "Are any of you actually listening?" Oro's voice broke through the noise and the incessant tapping. He slammed his hand onto the table, the force of the impact sending a shockwave through the room. The knife slipped from Corvash's fingers and embedded itself in the table with a resounding thunk. Gorik woke with a start, blinking in confusion as he looked around, while Zanara's tapping stopped instantly. Thalix snapped his attention from the ceiling, and Virel slowly turned toward Oro, a smirk forming at the corner of his mouth. "Do you think this is some kind of joke?" Oro continued, his voice rising in intensity. "Do you honestly believe you can afford to be this careless, this foolish, and underestimate the humans? Let me make something crystal clear. If you enter this military exercise with that attitude, you won't just lose, you'll be completely humiliated. Defeated so thoroughly that stories of your failure will echo for generations. You'll become a cautionary tale, a warning to all who hear it, about how Zoilea's finest fell because they failed to take the threat seriously." The room fell into an uneasy silence, the warrior's eyes now focused on Oro, the weight of his words starting to sink in. Oro let the stillness hang for a moment, his frustration starting to ease as he gauged their reactions. "This is your last chance to start taking this seriously," he warned, his voice steady but low. "If you leave here tonight still underestimating what you're up against, don't say I didn't warn you when the humans tear you apart." Zanara, with a playful glint in her eyes and fur glimmering in bright gold, couldn't help but laugh. "Looks like Oro's finally got our attention. Just hope he doesn't start assigning extra drills or something." "I didn't sign up for that." Corvash, the imposing leader with a long scar running down his face, ignored Zanara's teasing and gave Oro a thoughtful nod. Straightening up in his chair, he seemed to acknowledge that perhaps the class was more important than he had initially thought. The others followed his lead, their expressions softening just slightly as they took Corvash's cue. Varel, with a gleam of mischief in his eyes, leaned back in his chair and smirked. "Come on, Corvash. Oro's just an old alien who thinks too highly of himself. If we really want to deal with the humans, we should focus on some sneaky tricks. You know, like poisoning their water. Why sit through all this when we could win with so little effort?" He winked at the others, undermining Oro's authority and prompting a few chuckles and murmurs of agreement. Oro, resisting the urge to rip the mask off his face and throw it at Varel, decided to try a different tactic. "I had prepared a standard class for the Dosal, but since that's too boring for you, let me tell you a story about the time a human crash landed on my homeworld, Holadur." Oro pushed his voice to sound ominous, his eye almost bulging from his face as he pressed the metal mask against his skin. This caught the class's full attention, even Varel and Zanara, who now watched Oro with a mix of uneasy anticipation. It all started on a seemingly ordinary day. That morning, a streak of smoke appeared in the sky above Holadur, visible only to the people in a remote village who thought little of it at the time. Corvash leaned forward, showing a rare hint of interest in his otherwise stoic demeanor as he focused on Oro. His eyes locked onto the speaker, contrasting sharply with Varel, who had slouched back in his chair, feet casually propped up on the table. The smirk on Varel's face clearly showed he wasn't taking Oro's words seriously, his posture openly mocking the effort. Oro ignored Varel's dismissive attitude, directing his attention toward the few warriors who were still engaged. "The story begins with a human ship crashing in the desert," Oro said, his voice steady. The wreckage was a mangled pile of metal, scattered across the burning sands. From this fiery wreckage, a single human crawled out, barely alive, but somehow surviving the crash. His body was battered, his skin scorched by the heat of re-entry, yet he managed to free himself. As Oro paced slowly across the room, his eyes sweeping over the faces of his audience, he noticed Zanara had already started to drift off, her gaze wandering toward the window as though wishing to be anywhere but in that room. Varel, meanwhile, had his feet still on the table, lazily observing Oro with crossed arms, radiating utter indifference. Oro's frustration simmered beneath the surface, but he pushed forward. "The human couldn't salvage any food from the wreckage," Oro continued. "Alone in the vast desert with nothing but the clothes on his back, he faced certain death. No one to help him, no resources to sustain him, just endless sand in every direction. Yet rather than give up, he pressed on." Oro's voice grew more intense as he detailed the human's struggle. "For an entire day and night, the human trudged through the desert, the blistering sun scorching him by day, and the biting cold freezing him at night. Exhausted, dehydrated, and starved, he didn't stop. His body was on the brink of collapse, yet he pushed forward, driven by an instinct to survive." He paused for a moment, gauging the reactions of the class. Corvash remained focused, his sharp eyes locked on Oro as he absorbed every detail. But Zanara had once again lost interest, and Varel seemed more intent on annoying him with his disinterested gaze than on listening to the tale. Oro felt another stab of irritation, but he swallowed it down and carried on. As dawn broke, the human stumbled upon a treacherous forest. With hunger and thirst overriding his fear, he pressed deeper into the woods, finding sustenance in crushed fruits, roots, leaves, and small creatures. What would have been a terrifying environment for most species became, for him, a source of nourishment and shelter. Varel uncrossed his arms, leaning forward, a skeptical frown now replacing his smirk. "Come on, Oro," he said, his voice dripping with doubt. "Are you really expecting us to believe this? A species that survives on roots, leaves, and meat? That sounds like complete nonsense. How can one creature eat all of that? It doesn't add up. Are you sure you're not just making this up?" A ripple of agreement ran through the room. Zanara chuckled softly, her claws tapping out a rhythm again, while Gorik, now fully awake, nodded in agreement. Even Thalix, who had been engaged earlier, seemed unsure, his gaze flicking between Varel and Oro. Unfazed by the disruption, Oro folded his arms and looked at the group. "Humans are neither strictly carnivores nor herbivores," he said firmly. "They are omnivores, capable of eating a wide range of foods. Some can even survive on tree bark, earthworms, or insects when necessary. Their diet is as flexible as they are, and they can survive on nearly anything. They just don't choose to, unless they have to." He let his words settle in the air for a moment, watching the class's reactions. Corvash remained absorbed, while Varel rolled his eyes, clearly unimpressed. But there was a hint of interest in the eyes of another warrior. Thalix, the youngest of the group, leaned forward, his curiosity apparent. "So what happened to the human after he ate?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence that had fallen over the room. Oro felt a surge of satisfaction at the question. "The human found a river," he continued, his voice taking on a more narrative tone. "And he continued to survive in that forest. He built a shelter from leaves, sticks, and tree bark, materials that wouldn't even cross most of your minds in a situation like that. But for the human, it was instinct. Survival to them is second nature." Oro walked among the class, his sharp gaze moving from one student to the next. Zenara was still half distracted, but Varel was now watching him more closely, his earlier skepticism replaced with reluctant interest. Gorik listened intently, the weight of the story beginning to sink in. "And then one day," Oro said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "the human came across one of the deadliest creatures on Holadur, the Kohl. A creature so terrifying, even my people would shudder at the sight of it." For a brief moment, the class fell silent, their full attention now focused on Oro. Even Varel's smirk faded, and his gaze sharpened as he listened intently. "But unlike my people," Oro continued, "the human didn't know the creature was fiercely territorial. He didn't experience the same fear, the same instinct to flee. Instead, over the course of many days, he began feeding the creature some of his food. Gradually, the bond between the human and the Kohl grew, and before long, the creature started to accompany the human on his hunts." Oro paused for a moment, letting the full weight of the story settle in. The class was now completely hooked, even Zenara, whose usual playful demeanor had softened under the gravity of the tale. For the first time, Oro felt like he had their full attention, while almost all of them, Varel, however, seemed bothered by something. Varel slowly lowered his feet from the table, his earlier cocky attitude fading into a more serious expression. Leaning forward, he rested his elbows on his knees and voiced his skepticism. "So we're supposed to believe that some human crashed on a planet and did something your entire species couldn't do in all your history? Come on, Corvash, Zenara," he said, turning to his peers. "There's no way you're actually buying this." Corvash, the leader, exchanged a thoughtful glance with Zenara. Her usual grin had faded, replaced by a more contemplative look. The dim light in the room glinted off her bright copper fur as she subtly nodded. Both of them turned their focus back to Oro, their attention now fully on him, waiting for his response. Oro touched his metal mask, the cool surface grounding him as he took a deep breath. His chest, covered in green skin that had weathered countless battles, expanded as he prepared to speak. "Humans have a long history of domesticating wild animals," he began, his voice steady. "They've tamed wolves into dogs, bred horses for battle, and even trained birds of prey to hunt. What that human did with the Kohl wasn't some rare anomaly. It's in their nature. For thousands of years, humans have turned wild creatures into allies." As he spoke, Oro moved closer to Varel, locking eyes with the young warrior in a way that made Varel shift uncomfortably in his seat. "You think this is just a story, Varel? Well, imagine this. In the upcoming military exercises, what if a human decides you're cute? They might try to make you their pet, and once they've scratched your belly, well, that's game over for you." The room fell into a heavy silence before erupting into laughter, Oro's words hanging in the air like a challenge. Thalix, unable to contain his curiosity, finally broke the silence. "What happened to the human after he tamed the Kohl?" he asked eagerly, his voice full of anticipation. Oro glanced around the room, noting that while Varel still appeared skeptical, the rest of the class was fully engaged. It was a small victory, but one that fueled his momentum. "The human began to explore the area around his shelter," Oro continued, his voice calm yet compelling. "And one day, he stumbled upon the village that had seen the trail of smoke from his crash days earlier." As he spoke, Oro paced the room, his eyes briefly scanning the metal beams above. "The human was spotted by the village guards as he approached the gates," he said, his tone intensifying. This led to a tense first contact. The situation nearly escalated to violence, with both sides unsure, weapons on the brink of being drawn. Oro paused, looking around at the warriors, noting their rapt attention. As the human stood before the gates, the Kohl, his tamed beast, moved to his side. Its mere presence was enough to prevent the guards from attacking. What followed was a tense conversation, and soon, the village chief, a middle-aged male named Oromor, was summoned. As he continued recounting the tale, Oro realized he had gone beyond the lesson he had originally planned. He touched his metal mask thoughtfully, wondering if he had already made his point about human resilience and unpredictability. Perhaps it was time to wrap it up. But then he saw Thalix's ears twitch with excitement, his wide eyes fixed on Oro, eager for more. The young warrior leaned forward, practically salivating with anticipation. "Master," Thalix spoke with respect, his voice tinged with eagerness. "Please continue." Oro sighed, realizing there was no turning back. The class was hooked. He gave in to their silent demands and continued. When Chief Oromor arrived at the gates, Oro resumed, he had a tense conversation with the human, who was equipped with a universal translator. After assessing the situation, Oromor allowed the human into the village, but only under the condition that the coal would remain outside. The two exchanged names, Oromor and the human, Dylan. However, unlike the guards, Oromor wasn't impressed by Dylan's appearance. He saw no great strength in the human and invited him into the village as a trap, planning to separate him from the call and attack him when he was alone. Varel, leaning back in his chair with a smug smile, couldn't resist chiming in. "Now that's clever," he said with a hint of sarcasm. "Unlike those easily fooled guards, Oromor actually seems like he has some sense." Oro's expression darkened, and he touched his metal mask as if to steady himself. His voice rose with anger. "Oromor is the fool." The sudden outburst caused the room to tense, and Oro quickly realized he had let his emotions slip. He lowered his tone, his gaze softening as he noticed the class's reactions. Wide eyes, startled glances, and even Corvash sitting up a little straighter. Oromor was setting himself up for failure, Oro continued more calmly. Because Dylan, the human, had strengths beyond anything Oromor could have imagined. Varel interrupted, his smirk still in place. "So now this Dylan guy is alone in the village, right? Oromor and the guards could just take him out, and that would be that. It'd be an easy win for them." Oro turned his gaze toward Varel, saying nothing for a moment. There was something unsettling about how the young docile warrior reminded Oro of his past self. The arrogance, the overconfidence, it felt far too familiar. Struggling to keep his voice steady, Oro spoke at last. That was Chief Oromor's plan from the beginning, but the human was far too friendly. In the short time it took for Oromor to return to his home to fetch a weapon, Dylan had already befriended the guards and charmed the street vendors, offering to teach them how to tame a coal in exchange for their help in communicating with his people. Seeing an opportunity to make a broader point, Oro's voice grew more steady. Humans possess a charisma that ranks among the highest of all known species. Unlike many others, they can form bonds quickly, even in hostile environments, making them all the more dangerous. Varel interrupted again, but this time his words earned a few sharp glares from his peers. Oromor is an idiot if he fell for that. And if he didn't, he could have just pretended to be nice and attacked the human when he was alone. Oro's patience was wearing thin, but he saw too much of his younger self in Varel to be harsh. By your standards, Varel, Oromor was actually smarter than you think. The chief didn't just pretend to be friendly. He invited Dylan to stay in his home while secretly hiding the blade he'd brought within his clothing. Varel opened his mouth to speak, but a glance at Corvash's stern expression, Zanara's narrowed eyes, and even Thalix's intense gaze made him reconsider. He fell silent, allowing Oro to continue. Dylan accepted Oromor's invitation and followed him to his home, Oro said, his voice now more controlled. The chief waited for the right moment to strike, but as they walked, it became clear that Dylan's awareness was exceptional. Oromor, a seasoned fighter, couldn't find a single opportunity to attack. When they reached the door of Oromor's home, Dylan had still not let his guard down for even a second. Varel looked like he was about to speak again, but Zanara leaned over and whispered, "If you interrupt again, I'll bite you." Her tone was light, but there was an edge to it that made Varel think twice. Oro noticed the exchange, and though the story was nearing a tense moment, the growing interest of the young warriors pushed him to continue. Chief Oromor was planning to risk everything and attack Dylan head-on, but before he could decide, his daughter Haxia opened the door. Oromor had no choice but to maintain his act longer than he had planned. Before he could stop it, Haxia had already heard Dylan's story of surviving the crash and invited him to share a meal. Zanara interrupted with a grin. "I see where this is going." Her words were playful, but Oro ignored her, pressing on, struggling to hide the sadness that tugged at him. To maintain appearances, Oromore had no choice but to offer the human a place to stay for the night, Oro continued, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. Soon, neighbors began gathering to meet the human, and before Oromore knew it, his house was full. He had lost his chance to quietly deal with Dylan. Oro paused for a moment, reflecting on the story, and Virel took the opportunity to speak. Oromore is a fool if he let things get that far. There are plenty of ways to kill someone quietly, poisoning their food, for instance. Oro didn't feel anger this time, just deep disappointment. Virel, you and Oromore must be brothers from different worlds and times. Because believe me, Oromore did try to poison the human, many times, but each attempt failed. Give humans something as fiery as capsaicin, and they'll call it spice. Offer them alcohol, and they'll ask for more. Dylan didn't just survive Oromore's poison, he seemed to enjoy it. Oro paused, lost in thought for a moment, the weight of his memories settling over him. The warriors were nearly identical in their reactions, eyes wide in disbelief, mouths agape. But Virel, of course, was still defiant, his gaze full of skepticism and challenge. Something in that look struck a chord deep within Oro, and he knew he had to continue, though he had never intended to go this far. Oromore's rage was a storm, Oro said, his voice darkening, heavy with the horror of what he was about to recount. His anger wasn't just from his failures, but from the realization that he had become a guest in his own home. Oro's footsteps were slow and deliberate as he moved closer to Virel, his towering form casting a shadow over the young warrior. Leaning down, the eye behind his metal mask loomed above Virel, its intensity filling the space. One day, after returning from an inspection, Oromore found Dylan and Haxia in a corner, kissing. I knew that's where this story was headed. Zanara began to speak, but her voice trailed off as she caught sight of Oro's expression. It was too grave, too menacing for her usual playful remarks. Oro pressed on, his voice now full of menace, the tension in the room thickening like a coiled spring. Virel, now visibly uncomfortable, shifted in his seat, his fur flattening as if he could shrink away from Oro's imposing presence. Oromore's anger exploded. He attacked Dylan, throwing punches, but Dylan took them all, without flinching, without a single reaction. When Oromore grew tired and believed the human must be dead, his fury turned on his daughter. He grabbed Haxia by the hair and dragged her through the door, out into the village, shouting her shameful act for all to hear. Oro leaned even closer to Virel, his voice low but filled with an edge of madness. Oromore dragged Haxia through the streets until he found a pile of dry wood meant for an execution set to happen a few days later. Blinded by rage, Oromore tied his daughter to a pole above a pile of dry wood and set it aflame, accusing her of treason against their species for the entire village to hear. The room fell into an unnerving silence, the air thick with a sense of dread. Oro's voice dropped lower, transforming into a tone that could have belonged to an elder telling a ghost story to frighten children. But things didn't unfold the way Oromore had planned. As he leveled his accusations at his daughter, her screams filling the air, Dylan, this human, came running toward them, his face bloodied. Without a second thought, he stepped straight into the burning wood and pulled Haxia from the flames, as though the fire couldn't touch him, as though he didn't even feel the agony of the burning heat beneath his feet. The warriors stared at Oro, their faces painted with horror. Corvash, usually composed and stoic, had completely lost his usual control, his expression twisted in shock. Zanara, her quick wit and humor gone, was frozen in place, her mouth hanging slightly open. The youngest of the group, Thalix, had his hand clamped over his head as though trying to block out the horrific images Oro's story had conjured. Even Virel, the ever-skeptical provocateur, looked shaken, his body rigid as though the story had struck something deep inside him. But Oro wasn't finished yet. With a slow, deliberate movement, he reached for his iron mask. The scraping sound of metal against his skin echoed in the silent room. As Oro removed the mask, the warriors braced themselves, unsure of what they would see. What they were met with was more terrifying than they could have imagined. His face was a nightmare brought to life. Parts of his skin had been charred and melted, the twisted features barely resembling anything human. Scars crisscrossed his face and his previously obscured eye bulged unnaturally, surrounded by raw, exposed flesh. This, Virel, Oro said, his voice now a guttural rasp, is what happened when the human finished rescuing Haxia and came for Oromor. Oro's bulging eye seemed to pierce through Virel's very soul. With a single punch, he destabilized Oromor, then dragged him across the ground like a sack of dirt, forcing his face into the flames as he screamed. The terror in Oro's voice, combined with the sight of his disfigured face, sent a shockwave through the room. Virel, who had been sitting closest to Oro, was the most affected. His eyes widened in pure horror, and he recoiled so sharply that his chair tipped backward, crashing to the ground. A mess of fur and limbs. Virel scrambled to get back up as if the mere sight of Oro's face had burned him. For a moment, Oro stood there, allowing the stunned silence to fill the room, his disfigured face laid bare. It was suffocating. Only then did Oro realize how much he had revealed. He had let the lesson slip too far, become something personal he hadn't intended. The looks of terror on the warriors' faces told him he had crossed a line, one that should have stayed untouched. Oro took a step back from Virel, moving slowly to a corner of the room, as if trying to distance himself from the raw emotions he had just unleashed. He steadied his voice, attempting to steer the lesson back to where it was meant to go. Oromor wasn't celebrated for his actions when he woke up days later, Oro said, his voice subdued, almost hollow. Instead of finding understanding, he learned that the village had turned against him. They stripped him of his title, and as the ultimate punishment for our kind, they severed his name in half. Oromor was no more. Oro stared at the floor as he spoke, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. And so I, Oro, received one last piece of news before leaving the planet for a life in space. The human had been rescued by his people days later. He was allowed to take Haxia and his pet Cole with him. Oro could hardly bring himself to look at his students, ashamed of how far the story had gone. But he knew he had to finish the lesson, if only to bring some closure to the horror he had shared. With this class, we finish our lesson, Oro said, his voice firm despite the tremor of regret beneath it. I hope now you understand why it's such a terrible idea to challenge the humans in the upcoming military exercise. They are the kind of Deathworlders who crash onto a hostile planet with nothing and leave with a new pet and a girlfriend they rescued from a terrible father. A father who will never see her again, except in unreliable rumors that they may or may not have gotten married on some wild planet far from here. The room remained silent, the weight of the story pressing down on everyone. Oro's gaze fell to the floor as he stood near the door, waiting for the class to leave, the lesson imparted, and the pain of his past laid bare. Oro stood at the front of the room, expecting nothing but silence as the warriors filed out, the lesson's weight hanging heavily in the air. But as they began to leave, something unexpected happened. Virel, the first to pass by, stopped for a moment. His usual smugness was gone, replaced by a rare seriousness. I won't challenge the humans. You win, he muttered, his voice low but resolute. Oro didn't respond, simply nodding in acknowledgement as Virel left the room. Zinara followed, pausing beside Oro. Her usual playful demeanor was softened. Hey, cheer up, she said gently. I bet they're happy now. Haxia might even forgive you if you find her. If I were her, I would. Her words, though meant to comfort, only deepened the ache in Oro's chest. Oro gave a small, appreciative nod as Zinara offered him a faint smile before heading out. Thalix, the youngest warrior, approached with his ears still pressed back, clearly affected by the story. Good story, Master Oro, he said quietly, his voice filled with admiration. Thalix gave a respectful nod and walked out, his steps light but thoughtful. Oro listened as the remaining docile warriors left the room in silence, their footsteps echoing in the now empty space. He thought the lesson had come to a close until he felt a strong, unexpected embrace around his shoulders. It was a warmth he hadn't anticipated. Looking up, he saw Corvash, the tallest and most imposing of the group, holding him in a firm embrace. The larger warrior gave Oro's shoulder a rare, reassuring pat. Corvash's voice, deep and measured, filled the room. If I get the chance, I'll ask the humans about Haxia. I'll do it, even if it means challenging them for it. His words were heavy with a promise, a vow delivered with the sincerity that only Corvash could muster. Oro looked up at him, but before he could reply, Corvash turned and left, his heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor. Alone now, Oro stood in the empty classroom, the silence pressing down on him. The emotions of the day, the painful memories he had unearthed, and the unexpected warmth from his students all crashed in on him. A few droplets fell, unnoticed by anyone but him. He wiped his face quickly, then replaced his iron mask where it belonged. With a heavy heart, Oro turned and left the classroom, the echoes of a lesson that would not soon be forgotten lingering behind him. Elias stood at the front of the room, expecting nothing but silence as the warriors filed out, the lesson's weight hanging heavily in the air. But as they began to leave, something unexpected happened. Garrett Cole, the first to pass by, stopped for a moment. His usual smugness was gone, replaced by a rare seriousness. "I won't challenge the humans. You win," he muttered, his voice low but resolute. Elias didn't respond, simply nodding in acknowledgement as Garrett Cole left the room. Celine Blackwood followed, pausing beside Elias. Her usual playful demeanor was softened. "Hey, cheer up," she said gently. "I bet they're happy now. Leora Griffin might even forgive you if you find her. If I were her, I would." Her words, though meant to comfort, only deepened the ache in Elias's chest. Elias gave a small, appreciative nod as Celine Blackwood offered him a faint smile before heading out. Caden Rivers, the youngest warrior, approached with his ears still pressed back, clearly affected by the story. "Good story, Master Elias," he said quietly, his voice filled with admiration. Caden Rivers gave a respectful nod and walked out, his steps light but thoughtful. Elias listened as the remaining docile warriors left the room in silence, their footsteps echoing in the now empty space. He thought the lesson had come to a close until he felt a strong, unexpected embrace around his shoulders. It was a warmth he hadn't anticipated. Looking up, he saw Thorn Voss, the tallest and most imposing of the group, holding him in a firm embrace. The larger warrior gave Elias's shoulder a rare, reassuring pat. Thorn Voss's voice, deep and measured, filled the room. "If I get the chance, I'll ask the humans about Leora Griffin. I'll do it, even if it means challenging them for it." His words were heavy with a promise, a vow delivered with the sincerity that only Thorn Voss could muster. Elias looked up at him, but before he could reply, Thorn Voss turned and left, his heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor. Alone now, Elias stood in the empty classroom, the silence pressing down on him. The emotions of the day, the painful memories he had unearthed, and the unexpected warmth from his students all crashed in on him. A few droplets fell, unnoticed by anyone but him. He wiped his face quickly, then replaced his iron mask where it belonged. With a heavy heart, Elias turned and left the classroom, the echoes of a lesson that would not be soon forgotten lingering behind him.